everyone. It is Monday, November the 30th, and Tuesday, December the 1st. We are back from Thanksgiving break and ready to hit the home stretch here before winter break. So we have 3 weeks left. The last couple of weeks, last 3 weeks, we've been talking about the American Revolution. We talked about the start of the revolution at Lexington Concord, and the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts that led up to that. We spent the next week talking about the Declaration of Independence, and then last week we talked about the actual war itself and the winning of the Revolutionary War. So what we're going to be talking about today is what comes next. So now that the former colonists have won and become an independent country, what do they do next? And that's form a government. So we're going to be talking today about the first government that the now former colonists established. We call this the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation are the first constitution of the now United States. And it's not the Constitution we think of, but this was the first attempt, and it doesn't work out for some of the reasons that we'll talk about today. But it's a start. So our objectives, we're going to discuss the ideas that guided the new state governments, describe the government under the Articles of Confederation, explain the ordinances of 1785 and 1787 and their importance to westward expansion, and we're going to identify the problems that were created by having this weak central government. And some of the terms that we'll use: constitution, executive, economic depression, and we'll talk about Daniel Shays. So what were some of the major successes and failures of the government under the Articles of Confederation? You have a new country. You have to have a new form of government. That's the first thing that you have to set up. But the Americans found out that the government that they set up didn't really work for them. Some new problems came up, and the government that they created was inadequate in addressing those issues. So even before independence was won, so even while, after the colonies had decided to break away from the British, and before the war was actually won at Yorktown, some of the states, they were colonies, but now states started to create state governments. So in most of the states, they created state constitutions, and they used the issues that they had with the British in doing that. So, they looked back at the issues they had with the British, taxation without representation, the quartering of troops, lack of free speech. So all those issues that they had with the British, they wanted to make sure that that wasn't going to be an issue in the new government that they were establishing. So remember, the colonists felt that the king abused his powers. So in that case, and for that reason, a lot of the states gave really not much power to the governor, who was the executive of the state. So the governor of a state is the executive. The equivalent of a president on a state level, if you want to say that. So we have the governor of Missouri, Mike Parson. He's the executive. He runs the state. Most of the powers, though, were given to the state legislature. So these were the people that were elected by the people. So in most cases, most states had a bicameral legislature, meaning they have a House and then a Senate, and these are mainly elected by the people. So the powers of the legislature are much more than the executive because of the fear of the abuse that they had suffered under the king. Most states allowed more people to vote than in colonial times. So here were, some pretty typical voter qualifications. You had to be white, you had to be a man, you had to be over 21, and you had to own property. But that excludes quite a few people, right? White. So that excludes all African Americans, especially those that were enslaved, but even free African Americans typically were not allowed to vote. Native Americans are a no. Women are a no. People under 18 are a no, clear up until about 50, 60 years ago in most cases. And then poor people or a no. You usually had to own property to be able to vote. So to make sure that people's rights wouldn't be abused again, a lot of states included a Bill of Rights in their constitution. And Virginia was the first of these. Remember, Virginia is the oldest colony. Virginia was kind of at the forefront of a lot of the rights. You know, we talked about the Virginia House of Burgesses way back a few weeks ago, and they had a Bill of Rights in their constitution. So here were some of the things that were in their Bill of Rights. And, you know, if they sound familiar, they should, because later on, a lot of these ideas are instituted into the U.S. Bill of Rights, which is tacked on as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we'll be talking about here in a few weeks. So with the Virginia Bill of Rights, you have freedom of religion. You have freedom of the press, which is, you know, the media. In this case, in these times, we're mainly talking about newspapers. You have a right to a trial by jury of your peers. So you have a right to not just be judged by a judge. You have a jury. Limits on searches, so what the government can search in your private possessions, such as your home. Limits on arrest, so you can't just be arrested for no reason. There has to actually be charges. There has to actually be a reason. And then no cruel and unusual punishment. So we're not going to have gruesome medieval executions like, you know, hanging, drawing, and quartering people. We're not going to torture people, that type of thing. And again, later on in a few weeks, when we get to the U.S. Constitution and we get to the Bill of Rights that's, you know, added on at the end as the first 10 amendments, you'll see a lot of these things repeat themselves. But so while the states are doing this, the Continental Congress is also coming up with a new constitution for the United States as a whole, for the national government. And what they come up with is something called the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation is the new plan that's instituted in 1777 by the Continental Congress. And, you know, you probably, you know, you hear the term Confederation, you probably think of the Confederacy, you know, the side of the South in the Civil War. And the reason is they were called themselves a Confederacy. The Southern states actually wanted to have a government that was more like this one that's set up, where the states have most of the power. And that's part of why they called themselves the Confederate States of America. So a lot of the concerns about colonial rule that shaped the new state constitutions also made shaped the Articles of Confederation as well. So in this, the powers of the central government, so virtually all the powers of the central government, which we'll talk about what powers they were in a second, are given to a Congress, a legislature that's elected by the people. So the powers of the legislature were given to this Congress. And again, it's the only one that's created. So there's no chief executive, so there's no president. So there's no president, there's no, you know, prime minister in the case of England, there's no one person. Congress is it. And then also, there's no national courts. Every state has their own courts. And then also in the Congress, every state is equal. So you guys know, like I know in my class, if you had me for geography last year, we talked about this. And if you have me this year in American history, we talked about it, that the House of Representatives is based on population, right? So California's got 55 representatives, whereas, you have 7 states like Wyoming and Alaska and Delaware that only have 1 because they're a very small state. In this case, that's not what happens. Every state's equal. Virginia, which is the biggest colony at the time, population-wise, versus, at the time, New Jersey and Delaware were very small. So they really gave, I don't know why it's upside down for us, but they really limited the powers of the national legislature. So the powers were pretty limited in what they were able to do. Here's what they could do. Here's what they were able to do. They were able to deal with foreign countries. So, they were able to negotiate with foreign countries. So if they want to negotiate a treaty with the British or with the French or that, They could also deal with the Native Americans, AKA, you know, make treaties with them, go back on those treaties, go to war with them, but deal with Native American relations. They could make laws. They could declare war. So they could declare war on another country or another entity if they needed to. They also had the ability to coin or borrow money. So they could borrow money if they needed to. And they could run a post office. So they could run a post office. But what was more important was what they weren't able to do. They weren't able to regulate trade, and they weren't able to collect taxes. So they weren't able to regulate trade. So they couldn't make any, at this time, understand this, that, you know, we think of ourselves as Americans, right? But at this time, people thought of themselves more in terms of their state. You know, hey, I'm a Virginian, or hey, I'm a New Yorker. They thought of themselves more in terms of their own state. So they were more loyal to their own state than the country as a whole. And that attitude goes clear through the Civil War, and that's part of why the Civil War happens. Even, you know, and that was part of the states' rights. That attitude doesn't, you know, really disappear until the 20th century. But powers that are not given Congress, they can't regulate trade between the states. Importantly, they can't collect taxes. They can create taxes, but they have no mechanism to collect them. So like today, Congress can make a tax, and what happens if you don't pay your tax? You're going to go to jail, right? The IRS is going to come and put you in jail if you don't pay your taxes. The IRS, you know, is going to mandate that, or they're going to garnish your paycheck, that type of thing. Back then, they had no power to do that. So they could create taxes, but if the states and the people didn't want to pay it, they had no recourse to do anything about it. So they were forced to completely depend on the states when they needed money. Whenever they wanted money or needed money for something, they had to ask the states. And what do you think the states said? Probably no. A lot of times the states were really in debt for the Revolutionary War, so they're like, hey, we don't have a bunch of extra money, we're not giving you money. So this really weakened the central government and gave a lot of power to the states. Also, some of the other states refused to approve the articles until other states gave up their claims to lands in the West. So for example, some of these states had absurd claims. So like little Connecticut here, Connecticut claimed that they owned this whole band of land clear to the Pacific Ocean, basically. They claimed that their charter gave them all of this clear to the Pacific Ocean. So the other states said, no, that's not happening. You know, let's make sure that we fix this before we go further. So you see some of the claims that, you know, these other states had. You know, Virginia's claiming stuff that's in Wisconsin now. You know, New York's claiming down in Kentucky and Tennessee. So finally, you know, the articles are approved, and then all this land that's in the light green here is turned over to the national government. But they were, you know, they were really valuable and great demand. So Congress passes 2 new laws to settle this land for the new country. The Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So 2 laws passed within 2 years that take care of this. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 divides the land into what are called townships. So the townships are basically, they take a piece of land and they chop it into pieces. And then, you know, each piece is sold. So they're selling piece by piece for this. And then within each township, one section would be set aside for a school. So they would take one of these sections on these grids and make it into a school, and then sell the rest of it. And you know, this was the nation leaders. They thought, hey, we need to have education. Our country's not going to survive without having education. So it's important within each of these townships that we establish a school. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 then creates a government for the Northwest Territory. So all those lands that are north of the Ohio River that flows out of Pittsburgh and flows till it ends and empties into the Mississippi River. And it guarantees basic rights for the settlers of that area. Importantly, it bans slavery in these new territories. So this new area that's established, no slavery in this area. And it creates a 3-step process for admitting new states. And in fact, 5 states are eventually created in this Northwest territory. So you have Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And you got a chunk of Minnesota too, but you know, most of Minnesota is later bought with the Louisiana Purchase that we'll talk about here later on in the quarter probably, or maybe next quarter. But you see here in Ohio, you see that, you know, you flash forward, you see the grid pattern here of the townships. So, you know, the government did succeed in organizing these Western lands, but it had a lot of other problems. States taxed each other's goods, so they put tariffs on each other to make goods more expensive from other states. So there was competition with that. Importantly, states used different money. So every state had different money. So, you know, we live in a border area, right? You know, some of you guys probably go to Kansas for stuff. You know, you go to the mall in Kansas and whatnot. Imagine if every time you had to, you know, go back and forth between the Missouri and Kansas border, you had to change your money. Like when you go to another country where you have to change your money. It creates, you know, a complicated situation that, you know, makes business hard. Congress had no money. We already talked about that. They didn't have the power to collect taxes. And if they needed money, they needed to ask the states. And the states basically told them to, you know, deal with it, that they weren't getting money from them. And then also, other countries ignored the United States. The United States was seen as kind of an up-and-coming country that didn't, you know, need any attention. Plus, who are you going to talk to? There's not a president to talk to. There's not an executive. There's just this Congress that has no power. So are you going to send a representative to talk to every one of these 13 states? It was not a situation other countries like to deal with. So to make it worse, we have an economic depression starting to grip the states. And a lot of this has to do with, you know, the revolution and the money that was owed from it. So farmers are hit pretty hard. A lot of farmers start to lose their lands because they fall behind on the payments they owe for them. And angry and in despair, you have a group of farmers that lead an uprising in Western Massachusetts. So not in Boston, but in Western Massachusetts, Daniel Shays. So Daniel Shays' rebellion, and he attacks an arms warehouse and tries to lead an uprising in Massachusetts. Eventually, the government, with Revolutionary War veterans, they do, you know, Horatio Gates, I think, is involved with this, but eventually they do put it down. But, you know, even though they managed to put this rebellion down, it shows a lot of weakness with the new government. So some people start to think, hey, we made a mistake here. We need to do something different. We need to have a stronger central government. So in response, Congress asked the states to send delegates to a convention in Philadelphia to, importantly here, revise the Articles of Confederation. They don't ask them to get rid of them. They ask them just to revise and fix the Articles of Confederation. But as we'll see in, you know, coming weeks, that's not what ends up happening. All right, guys, have a good day, and I will talk to you guys next week. See you guys.